This is supposed to be a talk about curators and their place in museums and their role in the mission of museums. But I thought it worth noting at the outset that we are talking about a highly imperfect arrangement, a Faustian bargain, for the privilege of having great works of art made accessible to the broadest possible audience. The quality of experience is inevitably compromised. It is surely notable that at the very moment public museums came into being in the late 18th century, there were those who opposed them and for what they saw as the institutionalization of works of art. The French critic and theorist Quatremer de Quincy, a friend of Canova, put it this way: the principal disadvantage attending the mania of collections and the bad use made of the works devoted to fill them arise from their robbing the arts of their legitimate patrimony, from disinheriting them in a manner and banishing them from every political, religious, and moral employment. The mock dignity conferred on objects locked up with so much respect lowers them in public opinion more than it raises them in value. And what sort of impression, I speak of the impression conveyed and received through sentiment, can works make so crowded and so mixed that no one can address itself individually to the spectator? How can any impression be made where all is necessarily distraction? Well, Quatremer was thinking of the Louvre, and he was responding to a manner of display that crowded as many works together as could fit on a wall. Nonetheless, the voice is unmistakably that of an elitist. At the very core of his criticism lies the dilemma of museums and the charge to curators to make great works of art accessible to a broad public without compromising their intrinsic values. We live in an imperfect world, but for most of us, museums have provided the unique site for extraordinary encounters with great works of art. Where then to start describing the tasks and the mission of a curator? Perhaps it's best to begin by listing the most obvious duties. Curators are the people in museums who undertake research in the area of their expertise and catalog the works under their purview. They decide which works of art should be on display and which consigned to storage, what juxtapositions to make in order to suggest a context or a historical narrative. They propose the acquisitions that expand and sometimes even reconfigure the collection. And they organize exhibitions that attempt to enrich our understanding of an artist or subject in ways that a book cannot. They give lectures. They are, in short, the behind-the-scenes, but hardly indifferent or unprejudiced interpreters of the past. A past comprised of works of art that have sometimes been amassed in a haphazard fashion and that reflect changes in taste as much as a coherent vision of history. A past that engages each of us in different levels and in different ways. And yet, if the day-to-day tasks of curators at different institutions seem superficially similar, their approach to these tasks is bound to differ, and sometimes profoundly. This is not only because, to take an obvious case, an American such as myself really does not operate with the same sense of the past or serve the same public as my European colleagues, but because the history of institutions each of us serves is so different. So let us acknowledge that there is no single model for museums, and that as similar as curatorial duties may seem at first, they often serve different purposes and embrace different attitudes towards the past, not least because our institutions are themselves the product of historical situations. Today, it's often said that to see a work of art in a museum is to see it divorced from its context and to therefore have a diminished experience, as though there was somehow a single contextual way to view an image. As we've seen, this position was already voiced by Quatremer de Quincy in the early years of the 19th century. Well, there have been many responses to this. In the 1904 design of the Berlin Museum, the great German curator-director Wilhelm von Bode specifically created several types of galleries. In some, such as the one on the screen, he mixed paintings and sculpture as well as the decorative arts. Now, Bode was an extremely broad-minded scholar and curator who did not limit his interests to one media alone. But on the ground floor, he created a hall that simulates a church nave, on the altars of which he placed paintings. He referred to these as period spaces. Of course, it was only a simulated experience, but it was an attempt to recontextualize the works of art. In short, our experience of a work of art can be significantly affected by things that have little to do with the work itself. But I would maintain that this happens also in museums, especially if the curator views it as a part of his or her mission to set up spaces for contemplation. It's the difference between a good and a poor installation. In the Prado, there is the case of Roger van der Weyden's Descent from the Cross, which is probably easier to contemplate in the Prado than it ever was in the church in Louvain, from which it was acquired by Mary of Hungary, the wife of Charles V. And certainly following its exemplary restoration, this picture leaves an overwhelming impression. For every truly great work of art creates its own terms. It is not dependent on its setting.